The air was thick with tension in Washington. It was the kind of atmosphere where every word, every gesture, was scrutinized. But even in a city that thrived on secrets, the news that just broke sent ripples of shock through the corridors of power. Senator Crockett, the fiery conservative from Texas, had long been a controversial figure. Known for his aggressive stance on immigration, his sharp criticisms of the establishment, and his unapologetic rhetoric, he had earned the loyalty of his supporters but also the scorn of his critics. His rise had been swift, his rhetoric fiery, and his promises of shaking up Washington seemed like a dream for those tired of the status quo. However, nothing in his past could have prepared the country for what was about to be revealed. It was an unexpected Thursday morning when the U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Columbia unsealed a trove of criminal charges against Senator Crockett. They weren't just allegations from a disgruntled former aide or opposition party smear tactics. These were formal charges, carefully crafted and sealed for months, waiting for the right moment to be exposed. The charges were staggering: bribery, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and even money laundering. According to the indictment, Crockett had used his political influence to solicit bribes from foreign entities and corporations in exchange for legislative favors. It was a well-orchestrated operation, involving shell companies, secret accounts, and intermediaries who ran a lucrative scheme to bypass U.S. laws. But there was something even more chilling that no one had anticipated. The arrest strategy, it turned out, had been set into motion long before the unsealing of the charges. There were whispers that suggested the arrest was a calculated political move, not just a legal procedure. Someone had planned Crockett's downfall with surgical precision, and they weren't going to stop there. News outlets exploded with the story. Political pundits speculated about the timing. The media was consumed with the scandal, but in Washington, behind closed doors, a different narrative was unfolding. Who had orchestrated this? What did they want? And, more ominously, was this the beginning of a much larger operation? As the nation watched in disbelief, one thing was certain: Crockett's political empire was about to crumble, but the true scale of the conspiracy was just beginning to surface. The scandal was unfolding fast, and every new piece of information felt like another blow to the already crumbling reputation of Senator Crockett. But as the media fixated on the salacious details of his alleged crimes, a deeper question lingered in the air: who was pulling the strings? Senator Crockett had always prided himself on being a self-made man, a figure who rose from humble beginnings to hold one of the most powerful seats in Congress. His public persona was that of a fighter, a man of principles, and a relentless opponent to the so-called swamp in Washington. But now, as the charges mounted against him, those very qualities seemed more like a carefully cultivated image, not the reality of the man behind the facade. There were murmurs in the halls of power that Crockett had been more than just a politician. He had been part of a much larger, darker network of power brokers, using his position not just to enrich himself, but to manipulate the very structure of the government. His network of contacts stretched from lobbyists to foreign diplomats, from high-profile businessmen to corrupt judges, all orchestrated through backdoor deals and covert exchanges. But the real shocker came when an anonymous whistleblower sent a batch of encrypted files to investigative journalists. The documents were a treasure trove, revealing a series of meetings, phone calls, and encrypted messages that painted a damning picture of Crockett's true role in the conspiracy. It wasn't just about bribery or financial corruption, it was about something much more sinister: an attempt to engineer key political outcomes by using his power to intimidate, blackmail, and undermine his political opponents. The revelation of these files sent shockwaves through Capitol Hill. But what really sent the political establishment reeling was the identity of one particular figure in the documents: the puppeteer. This shadowy individual, whose name appeared in numerous communications with Crockett, had never been publicly known, but it was clear that they were the mastermind behind the entire operation. The puppeteer had orchestrated not just Crockett's rise to power, but also his fall. It was a calculated move. Crockett had been the perfect pawn in a larger game, one in which the stakes were far higher than simple political influence. The puppeteer's goal was far more ambitious: to reshape the entire political landscape, to install a new order, and to consolidate power in the hands of an elite few. As the investigation deepened, authorities began to piece together that Crockett's arrest was part of a broader strategy to not only bring him down but to target others within his circle of influence. The puppeteer had left a trail, and Crockett's criminal charges were just the beginning of what was to come. Back in Texas, Crockett's supporters were in disbelief. They had stood by him, believing in the man who had promised them a fight against the establishment. To them, this was a betrayal, and they were eager to defend their hero. But even as they rallied behind Crockett, they were unaware of the larger game being played in the shadows. Who was the puppeteer? And why had they chosen Crockett as their tool, and their scapegoat? The answers were out there, buried deep within the web of political intrigue and betrayal. But finding them would take more than just a few investigative journalists or government agents. It would take someone willing to go further into the depths of Washington's darkest corners. As the nation reeled from the shocking revelations about Senator Crockett, the scope of the conspiracy was beginning to emerge in full. The puppeteer, whose name had now started to surface in classified government briefings, was not just a shadowy figure but a highly strategic player, connected to some of the most powerful, untouchable people in the world. What began as a scandal about Crockett's alleged criminal activities was quickly morphing into a story about a vast, coordinated effort to take control of the political machinery in Washington, with its roots stretching across the globe. The whistleblower who had exposed the encrypted files was still unknown, but it was clear they had access to an incredibly high level of information. Whoever they were, they knew that the truth would never surface unless they took matters into their own hands. It became apparent that Crockett, despite being at the center of this firestorm, was not the real target. He had merely been a stepping stone in the grand design of something much larger. Days after the files were leaked, an unsettling development shook Capitol Hill. Crockett's legal team began hinting at an even darker secret. The senator, they claimed, was being manipulated into a situation where he would take the fall for something far worse than what had been publicly exposed. But Crockett, still holding on to his bravado, insisted he was the victim of a plot to destroy him, one carefully crafted by those higher up the food chain. One of Crockett's closest allies, a former political strategist named Lucas Greer, had become suspicious. Greer, a seasoned veteran of Washington's dirty game, was no stranger to backstabbing or political maneuvering. However, as he began digging into the circumstances surrounding Crockett's arrest, he discovered unsettling details that pointed directly to the puppeteer. The deeper Greer looked, the more he found evidence of a coordinated effort to discredit Crockett and eliminate him as a threat to those who were orchestrating the entire scandal. Greer began to believe that Crockett had been betrayed by the very people who had once helped elevate him to power. Those who had whispered in his ear, who had guided him through the political maze, were now quietly pulling the strings to destroy him. They had manipulated Crockett into becoming a symbol of everything that was wrong with Washington's corrupt political system, while they pulled the strings from the shadows. As Greer's investigation deepened, he learned that the puppeteer was not just pulling political strings but had also orchestrated the arrest strategy. The plan was meticulously designed, with Crockett's downfall serving as a public spectacle, a lesson to others who dared to challenge the invisible forces that controlled Washington. The puppeteer's ultimate goal was to send a message: no one, no matter how powerful, was beyond their reach. But what Greer uncovered next shocked him to his core. Crockett had not been the only pawn in this game. There were others, high-ranking members of Congress, corporate moguls, and international figures, each of whom had been manipulated into doing the bidding of the puppeteer. The arrest of Crockett was only the beginning of a larger political purge. As Greer rushed to piece together the puzzle, he received a chilling phone call from an untraceable number. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, and cold. "You're getting too close, Lucas," the voice said. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. If you want to survive, you'll stop digging." Greer's heart raced. He knew he was walking a dangerous line now. The puppeteer's reach seemed endless. If he continued, it wouldn't just be Crockett's downfall, it would be his own. But Greer couldn't stop. The truth was too important. He had to find the identity of the puppeteer, before they found him. The phone call had been a warning, but it only fueled Lucas Greer's determination. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, but he couldn't back down now. If he stopped, the power behind the puppeteer would remain unchecked, and more political careers, more lives, would be destroyed without a trace. What had started as a personal mission to help Crockett clear his name had turned into a quest for justice against a shadowy figure who had wormed their way into the very fabric of the U.S. government. Greer quickly realized that the puppeteer had played everyone, Crockett, his allies, his enemies, and now even him. Every step of his investigation had been guided by what the puppeteer wanted him to see. Every misstep, every trail that seemed to lead to a dead end, was all part of the larger plan. It was a game, and Greer was just another piece on the board. But that didn't make him give up. Instead, it only made him more dangerous to the puppeteer. As the days passed, Greer grew more paranoid. There were signs that his every move was being watched. He received strange, cryptic messages from anonymous sources that hinted at deeper secrets about not just Crockett's role, but the entire network of corruption that ran through Washington, from the highest echelons of power to the most obscure corners of the city. One night, Greer met with a source, someone from within the ranks of the federal law enforcement. They had grown disillusioned with the political system, and in exchange for their help, Greer had promised to keep their identity hidden. The source revealed that Crockett wasn't the only high-profile politician caught up in the puppeteer's web. There were others, waiting to be taken down in a calculated move that would shake the country to its core. But this source also had something even more shocking to share: the puppeteer's identity was no longer a mystery. It wasn't some nameless figure working in the shadows, it was someone who had been in plain sight all along. The puppeteer. "It's Eleanor Ford," the source whispered, their voice barely audible. Eleanor Ford was a name Greer knew well. A long-serving senator from Illinois, she had long been seen as a master of the political game. Ford was a powerful player, a behind-the-scenes operator who had orchestrated more than one successful campaign to turn political rivals into allies. It had always been whispered that Ford had a special influence over the justice system and law enforcement, but no one had ever managed to prove it. Now, it appeared that those rumors were not just rumors. Ford had been working the system like a puppet master, with no one the wiser. Greer could hardly believe what he was hearing. Eleanor Ford had been pulling the strings all along. The woman had built a reputation as an old-school politician with impeccable credentials and an unassailable public image. But underneath it all, it seemed, she had been playing both sides, manipulating both the left and right to maintain control. Greer knew that he needed to act fast. He couldn't afford to sit idly by while the puppeteer consolidated their power. But Ford's reach was vast. She was untouchable, until now. The next step was clear. Greer had to expose Ford, but he couldn't do it alone. He needed allies, and that meant reaching out to the only people who had a reason to go after Ford, those who had already been crushed by the puppeteer's game. There were others like Crockett, who had been used and discarded, who had been dragged down by the same forces that controlled Washington's political machine. Greer's next move would put everything on the line. The truth needed to come out, no matter the cost. If the puppeteer's scheme was allowed to succeed, the very foundation of democracy would be shattered. But exposing Eleanor Ford wasn't going to be easy. She had already seen the traps others had fallen into, and she wasn't going down without a fight. As Greer prepared for the battle ahead, one thought ran through his mind: this was no longer about saving Crockett or restoring his career. It was about dismantling an entire political empire. It was about exposing the people who had rigged the system for their own gain, and stopping them before they could tighten their grip even further. The final confrontation was coming. And when it arrived, the stakes would be higher than anyone could imagine. The clock was ticking, and Lucas Greer could feel the pressure mounting with every passing hour. The closer he got to exposing Eleanor Ford, the more dangerous the game became. Ford had managed to weave herself into the very fabric of Washington's power structure, building relationships and controlling people with ruthless precision. She was the quiet force behind the curtain, and now Greer was preparing to tear that curtain down. Greer knew the risk. Ford was no amateur, she would have anticipated moves like his. He had to be careful, strategic. The last thing he wanted was to walk right into a trap. But time was running out. Ford's network was closing in on Crockett, and every day that passed saw another politician or figure aligned with her collapse under the weight of the conspiracy. If Ford wasn't stopped now, she would have the entire system under her thumb, and anyone who stood in her way would be obliterated. He started reaching out to the few remaining allies he had left, people who knew what Ford was capable of, people who had either fallen victim to her game or managed to slip out of her control. It wasn't easy. Most were terrified, unwilling to risk their reputations or careers by taking on someone with Ford's influence. But Greer knew that alone, he stood no chance. He needed the support of those who had seen Ford's true face. The first breakthrough came when Greer met with an ex-journalist named Carla Hayes. She had once been a rising star in investigative reporting, but after publishing a series of exposés about corporate corruption, she had found herself blacklisted from most major news outlets. In private, she confided that Ford had been behind a series of smear campaigns that had ruined her career. Ford didn't just play the game, Lucas, Carla said, her eyes hardened by years of frustration. She rewrote the rules. And anyone who questioned her, they were erased. Politicians, journalists, businessmen, they've all been sacrificed for her ambition. Carla handed Greer a stack of files, redacted documents and photographs that she had kept hidden for years. These documents were damning. They connected Ford to various shady dealings, from international money laundering operations to manipulating election results. But the most chilling discovery was a file labeled Project Overlord. Project Overlord was Ford's contingency plan, Carla explained, her voice low. If things ever went sideways, if someone like you started digging too deep, she'd have a list of people to go after, people who could expose her, and people who had evidence against her. Crockett's arrest was part of it. He was just a pawn, but a valuable one. And you, Lucas, you're next on the list. Greer felt the weight of those words settle over him like a stone. He knew he was walking into something far bigger than he had ever imagined, but he also knew he couldn't back down. The truth had to come out. With the documents in hand, Greer made his move. He went straight to the media, directly to a respected news outlet that had been blacklisted by Ford in the past. He knew they were the only ones who could handle the scale of the story and withstand the fallout. But getting them to run the story would be a battle in itself. Ford's influence reached deep into the media, and anyone who dared challenge her faced ruin. Greer was ready for war. It wasn't long before the storm began. The first leaked stories hit the news, carefully timed with the unsealing of more official records that corroborated the evidence in the documents. Ford's name appeared on the front page of every major newspaper, and it didn't take long for the public to start asking questions. The conspiracy that had once been a whispered rumor was now out in the open, and people were demanding answers. Ford's response was immediate and fierce. Within hours, her political allies rallied behind her, calling the allegations baseless, part of a smear campaign, and an attempt to destabilize the government. But the more they denied, the more the evidence piled up. Leaked communications between Ford and foreign lobbyists, meetings with CEOs who had funneled money into her campaigns, and damning testimony from insiders who had worked with her for years, it all painted a picture of a woman who had used her power to manipulate, destroy, and control. As Ford's empire began to crack, the truth that Greer had uncovered became undeniable. But the battle was far from over. Ford was no longer just a politician, she was a figurehead of an entire network of corruption, and those who had been involved with her would stop at nothing to protect their own interests. The FBI opened a full investigation into Ford's activities, but Greer knew that the fight was only just beginning. The puppeteer had never been just one person, it was a collective of people who would go to extreme lengths to preserve their power. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, Greer received a call, a message from a familiar voice that made his blood run cold. "You think you've won, Lucas?" Ford's voice was icy and calm. "This isn't over. You've merely exposed a fraction of the truth. You have no idea how far the reach of my influence goes. And now you've made your final mistake. Greer's grip tightened on the phone. He had no illusions about what was coming. He wasn't just fighting a corrupt politician anymore. He was fighting a system that had entrenched itself in the very heart of American power. But he was ready for the final confrontation. The reckoning was coming. And when it did, everything would change. Lucas Greer had known the risks of taking on Eleanor Ford. He had understood from the beginning that she was no ordinary politician, she was the embodiment of the system that had eaten away at Washington from the inside. But as the heat of the battle intensified, Greer felt the weight of the stakes grow heavier. Ford had never been one to play fair, and now that her empire was crumbling, she was pulling out all the stops to ensure her survival. Greer could feel the noose tightening. He had gone public with the evidence, but Ford was no ordinary target. She had been one step ahead every moment of this fight, and now, as her carefully constructed world began to unravel, she was poised to strike back with an unprecedented vengeance. The media frenzy was still in full swing. Reporters, pundits, and political analysts were dissecting every aspect of Ford's career. Public outrage was growing. People were demanding her resignation, but Ford was relentless. Behind the scenes, she was orchestrating a counterattack, quietly working to discredit Greer and anyone who dared to support his findings. It wasn't enough for her to weather the storm, she needed to make an example out of him. But Greer wasn't about to back down. In a darkened office late one evening, Greer sat with the stack of documents that Carla Hayes had handed him. He knew there was one more bombshell left to drop, one final piece of evidence that could shatter Ford's influence and expose the full extent of her corruption. It was a series of encrypted emails from the highest levels of government, and it had taken Greer weeks to decipher them with the help of trusted sources in cybersecurity. These emails proved that Ford had not only manipulated elections but had also colluded with foreign governments to push her own agenda. It was a game changer. This wasn't just about financial corruption or political maneuvering, Ford's hands were tied to international schemes that endangered national security. These were the kinds of revelations that could bring down not just a single politician but the entire infrastructure of Washington that had allowed her to thrive. With the evidence in hand, Greer took a calculated risk. He reached out to an investigative journalist named Sarah Winters, one of the few reporters left in Washington who had not been intimidated by Ford's power. Sarah had spent years covering the hidden side of politics, and her reputation for bravery in the face of danger made her the perfect ally in this final battle. They arranged to meet at a secluded diner on the outskirts of the city, a place where no one would be watching. It was risky, but it was the only place they could talk freely without the fear of being intercepted. The diner was quiet, the kind of place that seemed frozen in time. As Greer sat down across from Sarah, he couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. Everything had led to this moment. "I've got the last piece of the puzzle," Greer said, pushing the stack of documents toward Sarah. "These emails are the nail in the coffin. If we publish this, it's over for her." Sarah's eyes flicked over the documents. The weight of what they represented was not lost on her. She knew this wasn't just another political scandal, this was something far more dangerous. "Are you sure, Lucas?" she asked, her voice low. "If we release this, there's no going back. Ford will come for us, and not just with lawsuits or public denials. We're talking about people who will stop at nothing." Greer nodded, his resolve unwavering. "I've already put everything on the line. I'm not backing down now." As they discussed the logistics of publishing the information, a sense of urgency filled the air. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. But as they finalized their plan, an unexpected phone call shattered their focus. Lucas, the voice on the other end of the line was familiar, but filled with an unsettling edge. It was Carla Hayes. "They know. They know everything." Greer's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "They're coming for you. They've already started discrediting Sarah. They've got people on the inside, Lucas, people who know everything you've been working on. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Ford's reach was far deeper than he had ever imagined. There were informants, spies, people who had been planted to infiltrate his inner circle and make sure the final blow never saw the light of day. "We need to act fast," Greer said. "Get the story out before they can shut us down." But as he said the words, he knew that they were already too late. Ford had anticipated this move. In a final, desperate act of control, she had already begun to implement a plan of her own. As Greer and Sarah moved to release the explosive emails, a breaking news report flashed across the screen. FBI issues warrant for Lucas Greer's arrest. Investigative journalist accused of conspiracy to frame senior politician. Greer's stomach twisted. The trap had been sprung. Ford had used her influence to frame him, turning the tables and making him the villain in this entire scandal. The man who had set out to expose the truth was now being painted as the mastermind of a smear campaign. "They're not just going after you," Carla said, her voice shaking. "They're going after everything. They'll destroy anyone who stands in their way." In that moment, Greer knew that the war wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about survival. Ford's strategy was clear: destroy the messenger and make the truth seem like a lie. But Greer wasn't finished yet. There was one last thing he could do. With no time to waste, he activated a series of contingency plans he had put in place, setting up encrypted channels for the documents to go live across multiple platforms. The information about Ford's international dealings, her election manipulations, and her collusion with foreign powers was about to be exposed, whether Ford liked it or not. As the world began to wake up to the shocking truths, Greer knew there was no going back. Eleanor Ford's grip on Washington was slipping, and it wasn't just the government that was at risk, it was the entire system that had enabled her and others like her. The reckoning had begun. The storm that had been brewing for months finally exploded. As Lucas Greer's final move set the truth in motion, the world was forced to confront the power that had quietly controlled Washington for so long. The leaked documents spread like wildfire across the internet, each one revealing layers of corruption, deceit, and international schemes orchestrated by none other than Eleanor Ford. The public's shock turned to outrage as they learned of the foreign influence Ford had wielded over U.S. politics, her manipulation of elections, and the vast web of people she had compromised. This wasn't just another political scandal, it was the unraveling of the very foundation of American governance. In response, Ford made a last-ditch attempt to salvage her reputation. Her allies in the media swung into full gear, calling the accusations false, claiming that Greer was nothing more than a disgruntled former journalist with an axe to grind. Her lawyers issued multiple threats, demanding that news outlets retract their stories. But it was too late. The truth was out. People weren't just questioning Ford's credibility, they were questioning the entire political system that had allowed her to thrive in the shadows for so long. As the days passed, the fallout grew worse for Ford. Her political allies, those who had once kissed the ring, began distancing themselves. Fear swept through the halls of Congress as whispers of her true nature turned into a loud, undeniable chorus. Every conversation seemed to be about her, and not in a way that could save her. Her power was evaporating, and she knew it. But she wasn't going to go down quietly. Behind the scenes, Ford began to make a series of desperate moves to cling to her position. She fired off a final, desperate letter to the president, warning that her downfall would trigger a political crisis of unprecedented proportions. She made calls to foreign governments, pleading for their support, hoping they would use their influence to shield her. But even the people she had once controlled were starting to abandon her. The world was watching, and no amount of manipulation could hide the truth anymore. And then, the unthinkable happened. The FBI, spurred by the weight of the evidence and the undeniable public outcry, began a full-scale investigation into Ford's activities. Arrest warrants were issued for several of her associates, and the authorities started to gather evidence on her. Ford had always been a master of controlling the narrative, but now, she was fighting to survive. Every move she made seemed to lead to a dead end, and her carefully cultivated empire began to crumble. In the chaos that followed, Ford made her final, catastrophic error. In an attempt to shift the blame, she tried to implicate a group of her colleagues in a broader conspiracy, a move that backfired spectacularly. Her enemies, once too afraid to stand up to her, now seized the opportunity to discredit her completely. She had lost all support, even from those who once shared her bedrock of power. Then, the inevitable happened. Eleanor Ford was arrested. The charges were staggering, far more serious than anyone had anticipated. Conspiracy, money laundering, election tampering, espionage, these were only the start. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Ford's network extended far deeper than anyone had ever imagined. In the end, it wasn't just Ford who was taken down. The political structure she had built, one that had allowed corruption to thrive unchecked for decades, began to collapse with her. The public clamored for a full investigation into the practices that had allowed figures like Ford to hold power for so long, demanding sweeping reforms and accountability from Washington's elite. For Lucas Greer, the war wasn't over, but his victory had been hard-earned. He had sacrificed everything to expose the truth, and though the fight wasn't entirely won, the world was finally starting to change. The grip of the puppeteer had been broken, and with Ford's arrest, there was hope that the shadows which had long hidden corruption in the political system were beginning to be lifted. As for Greer, his life had been irrevocably altered. He had gone from a reporter with a passion for justice to a whistleblower caught in a crossfire of political warfare. His name was now known to the public, not just as the man who brought down a corrupt senator, but as someone who had risked everything for the truth. But as the dust settled, Greer knew there would be others like him, others who would follow in his footsteps, who would refuse to let corruption fester unchecked. And though his fight had cost him his career, his safety, and his peace of mind, there was one thing he had regained: hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The collapse of Ford's empire marked a turning point, but Greer knew that the battle was never truly over. The struggle for a better, more accountable political system would continue. But for now, justice had been served. And that, in the end, was enough.